Welcome, dear listener. You found your way to the Sleepy Historian, a quiet corner of the internet where the noise of the present fades and the whispers of the past unfold in soft, measured tones. Here, we offer boring history for sleep, carefully told so that you can drift gently into slumber while wandering through old and half-forgotten worlds. Perhaps you search for bedtime relaxation and soft storytelling, or maybe you're one of those who enjoy a soft-spoken history documentary at the end of a long day. However you've arrived here, I invite you to settle down, dim the lights, and allow this tale of the medieval past to cradle you toward rest. If this kind of calm bedtime storytelling brings you a sense of ease, I ask you to consider supporting the channel, but only if it truly helps you find peace. If you do, feel free to like the video, subscribe for more relaxing history to fall asleep to, and share your own place in time with us in the comments below. It is a strangely comforting thought. Listeners scattered across the world, in different rooms and at different hours, all falling asleep to the same old stories of people long gone. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. You might be surprised at how many others are doing the very same thing, guided into sleep by history sleep stories. Tonight, we begin with a journey back to a place both familiar and forgotten, the medieval inn. These were waypoints scattered along winding roads, resting places for pilgrims, merchants, messengers, and the occasional wandering soul. They were not the grand castles that dominate our imagination, nor the vast cathedrals that soar across the skyline of history. Instead, they were modest, bustling centers of human encounter, part shelter, part tavern, part meeting hall, woven into the rhythm of medieval travel. Imagine yourself on a long, uneven road, the path soft with mud after a recent rain, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke drifting from unseen hearths. The day has been tiring, the light fading into a dusky haze, and your feet ache from the steady pace. Ahead, a wooden sign creaks in the evening wind, marking the inn. Perhaps it bears the simple image of a stag or a swan, or perhaps just a painted cross, symbols for the weary to recognize. The inn door is heavy, and when it opens, a low warmth spills out, mingled with the faint aroma of ale, stewing meat, and straw. This is where our history tonight will linger, not in the chronicles of kings and battles, but in the steady, ordinary hum of daily life. For behind the clamor of knights and lords, there stretched a network of roads and resting places where the rhythm of medieval travel unfolded in quiet necessity. Here, merchants bargained, minstrels sang softly, pilgrims exchanged stories of distant shrines, and tired bodies found a place to lie down. This forgotten world of medieval inns is not one of grandeur, but one of endurance, small comforts, and the simple fact of humanity pressing onward. Over the course of this gentle history, we will wander through 4 paths. First, we will immerse ourselves in the details of daily life within an inn, the routines of arrival, food, sleep, and social chatter. Then, we will follow a figure whose story is woven into the history of travel and lodging, considering how one life can mirror the needs of an age. After that, we will step into the mysteries of archaeology and culture, exploring how ruins, records, and fragments whisper of ins long since gone. Finally, we will look at the contrast between the travelers and those who lived among the upper reaches of society, comparing the simple wooden bench by the fire with the embroidered cushions of noble halls. Each segment is its own quiet step along this journey. Together, they form a path into a forgotten world where travel was slow, uncertain, and yet persistent, an echo of how humans have always moved, rested, and gathered. By the end, you may find that you are no longer following the words, but floating gently into dreams, lulled by the steady current of the past. So let us begin. Adjust your pillows, allow your breath to slow, and let the world of medieval inns unfold before you. Imagine yourself walking along a winding road that threads through the medieval countryside. The path is uneven beneath your feet, pressed into mud by carts and hooves, and softened by grass at the edges where wildflowers bend in the wind. The journey has been long and repetitive, one village blending into the next, fields stretching outward with little change, time marked only by the movement of clouds and the shifting of shadows. As daylight fades into the cool wash of evening, you notice the faint promise of refuge ahead. An inn. The inn, in many ways, was a cornerstone of medieval travel. Not glamorous, not often celebrated, but always necessary. Inns dotted the landscape in towns and along well-traveled routes, their doors open to the steady trickle of merchants, messengers, pilgrims, and wanderers who required food, rest, and shelter from the uncertainties of the road. Unlike the castles that housed lords or the monasteries that offered spiritual retreat, the inn was entirely practical, a place that combined hospitality with commerce, comfort with survival. The exterior might not have been impressive. Many inns were simply timber-framed houses, their walls whitewashed with lime, their roofs thatched or tiled, depending on local resources. Signs hung above their doors, painted animals, saints, or symbols recognizable even to the illiterate traveler. A stag, a swan, a crown, or a simple cross might signal the presence of a resting place. Approaching one of these buildings, you might hear the faint murmur of voices through the walls, punctuated by the creak of wood as doors swung open and shut. Stepping inside, the senses adjusted slowly. The air was thick with the mingled aromas of smoke, stewing meat, and damp wool from cloaks hung by the fire. The floor, strewn with straw or rushes, softened the tread of boots. Light came unevenly from tallow candles and the hearth, casting more shadow than brightness, but enough to create a sense of warmth after the cool of the road. Wooden benches and tables stretched across the common room, their surfaces marked by years of use, roughened by knives and stained by ale. At first glance, it was a simple environment. Yet to the weary traveler, it was a small world of comfort. The sound of voices carried a rhythm of familiarity. Traders debating prices, locals exchanging news, pilgrims whispering stories of shrines and relics they'd seen. There was laughter, subdued but present, weaving through the drone of conversation. The clink of pottery mugs and the dull thud of jugs placed on the table punctuated the evening like a slow drumbeat. For many, the arrival at an inn was a small relief after the uncertainty of travel. Roads were unpredictable. A sudden storm could leave you drenched and chilled. Bandits were a real, if irregular, threat. Even simple exhaustion from walking or riding for days left the body craving stillness. To step into the common room of an inn was to exchange the shifting discomfort of the road for something stable. Food, fire, and human presence. And yet, inns were not luxurious. They were places of necessity, not extravagance. A guest might pay for a place to sleep, but the bed would rarely be private. More often, it was a shared chamber, sometimes a shared mattress, with strangers sleeping shoulder to shoulder. Privacy was rare. Cleanliness was uneven. Yet for a tired traveler, even a rough pallet was preferable to the hard ground outside. Food, too, was practical rather than indulgent. An innkeeper might serve a stew of whatever was available: beef, mutton, or pork simmered with root vegetables, herbs from the garden, and bread baked that morning or the day before. Ale or weak beer was the common drink, safer than water, its taste earthy and familiar. On rare occasions, wine might be offered, but it was often thin and sour compared to the vintages prized in noble halls. The meal was nourishing, filling, and above all, communal. Eating in an inn was not only about sustenance, but also about sharing space, conversation, and the temporary fellowship of travelers. It is easy to imagine, as you sit at a long wooden table with a bowl of steaming stew, how different lives briefly intersected here. A merchant from a distant town might be seated beside a pilgrim bound for a holy site. A messenger carrying letters might sit across from a local farmer who had come into town for market day. The inn was a place where the ordinary threads of society were woven together in small, fleeting patterns. The arrival at the inn was not simply a pause in the journey. It was also a moment of reassurance. a reminder that even in an age of uncertainty and hardship, there were pockets of community and shelter along the way. For the tired traveler, the sight of an inn sign in the fading light was more than just a practical relief. It was a promise that the road, however long, could be endured one night at a time. As you let this image settle in your mind, the weary figure entering, the fire flickering, the murmur of voices, you might sense the quiet rhythm of medieval travel. It was not fast nor glamorous, but it was steady, and within its steadiness, there was a kind of peace. Picture yourself settled within the common room of the inn. The door has closed behind you, muting the sounds of the outside world. The creak of wagons on the road, the distant bark of a dog, the rustling of leaves in the evening wind. In their place comes a different kind of rhythm. The steady hum of human voices, the snap of kindling in a hearth, the scrape of wooden bowls across rough-hewn tables. This was the heart of the medieval inn, not a place of splendor, but one of constant, quiet utility. The innkeeper moved about with practiced ease, their role part host, part trader, part manager of a shifting, unpredictable crowd. Few guests stayed long, but each left behind coins, stories, and sometimes small troubles. The inn was not only a stopping place for individuals, but also a microcosm of the larger medieval world. Its divisions, its customs, its blend of necessity and social ritual. Food was often the first concern of the traveler. After hours on the road, the hunger was not for delicacies but for warmth and substance. A traveler might be served a bowl of thick stew, fragrant with leeks, onions, or garlic, its broth darkened by meat simmered down to tenderness. Bread, sometimes fresh, sometimes hard enough to soften only when dipped into the stew, would accompany the meal. The bread was often coarse, made from a mix of grains, rye, barley, or oats, depending on the region and the season. To wash it down, there was ale or weak beer brewed on site or bought from local brewers. It carried the taste of earth and grain, satisfying if not refined. Meals at an inn were shared experiences. Guests sat at long tables, shoulder to shoulder, and there was little distinction of rank beyond what each person could pay. A merchant with his satchel of goods might find himself beside a pilgrim with only a wooden staff and a patched cloak. A local laborer could sit across from a messenger bearing a lord's seal. This mingling was part of the inn's peculiar charm. Though not always peaceful, it allowed for moments of exchange between people who would rarely meet elsewhere. Stories were told, songs sometimes sung, and news of the wider world passed along from tongue to tongue. Conversation flowed as steadily as the ale. Pilgrims spoke of the shrines they had visited or planned to see, recounting miracles they had heard whispered about, or relics said to possess mysterious power. Merchants compared routes and prices, trading knowledge of roads, markets, and opportunities. Locals shared tales of their villages, harvests, or disputes, while travelers from afar added fragments of distant lands to the evening's chorus. Then became a crossroads of voices as much as a crossroads of roads. The innkeeper and their family were often central to this gathering. They not only served food and drink, but also kept order, ensured debts were paid, and occasionally acted as mediators in disputes. Their livelihood depended on striking a balance, welcoming enough to encourage repeat visits, firm enough to maintain authority. Inns could be lively, but they could also tip into disorder if the ale flowed too freely or tempers flared. For this reason, an innkeeper's presence was steady, always nearby, guiding the rhythm of the evening without overshadowing it. The common room itself bore the marks of daily use. Smoke drifted upward to the rafters, staining the beams over time with a dark patina. The rushes on the floor absorbed the spills and the mud tracked in from boots, and were replaced only when they became too foul. Candles burned low and uneven, their light flickering across faces and wooden walls. The hearth, though, was the anchor. Its fire was both literal warmth and a symbol of the inn's function, a circle of comfort within an often cold and uncertain world. Occasionally, entertainment brightened the hours. A wandering minstrel might appear, carrying a lute or a small harp, singing songs of saints, heroes, or love lost and found. These were not grand performances, but modest, almost soothing interludes that filled the pauses between conversation. Other times, a guest might recite a tale from memory, the kind of story that shifted slightly with each retelling, but always carried the familiar cadence of folklore. Such moments gave the inequality of shared humanity, an acknowledgement that travel was not only a physical journey, but also a thread woven into the fabric of community and culture. For those listening closely, the inn at night could feel like an archive of voices. The concerns of the age, faith, trade, survival, and wonder were all present, distilled into casual words exchanged over bowls of stew and mugs of ale. Unlike chronicles written by monks or records kept by lords, these were fleeting testimonies, unrecorded, carried away with the dawn as travelers departed once more. Yet for the span of a few hours, they created a space of connection, ephemeral but real. Gradually, as the evening wore on, the energy of the common room softened. The voices lowered, the mugs emptied, and the fire sank into a steady glow of embers. Travelers, full from their meals and weary from the road, turned their thoughts to rest. The inn shifted from a place of gathering to one of quiet retreat, though even in its quiet, the steady breathing of sleepers and the occasional creak of what kept the rhythm of life present. It is here, in the mingling of food, fellowship, and fatigue, that the medieval inn revealed its essence. It was not luxury, not elegance, but a reminder that even in times of hardship and uncertainty, people sought the same simple comforts we do today. A warm meal, a safe place to sit, a moment of conversation, and the knowledge that tomorrow's journey could begin anew. As the evening wore itself thin, the common room gradually shifted from a space of conversation to one of heavy-lidded silence. The fire, once lively and snapping, sank into a quiet bed of embers. Candles guttered low, their wax dripping steadily, and shadows stretched across the beams. One by one, travelers rose from the benches and turned toward the sleeping quarters. For many, this transition was both relief and resignation. A bed awaited, but it was not the private comfort we imagine today. In the medieval inn, sleeping arrangements were often shared. A room might contain several mattresses, or in some cases, only a single wide bed. Travelers, strangers only hours before, now lay shoulder to shoulder, cloaks folded under their heads, boots set aside within reach. Privacy was a luxury reserved for nobility. The common traveler accepted close quarters as part of the journey. Sometimes curtains or partitions offered a measure of separation, but just as often, there was none. The beds themselves were modest. A wooden frame might be filled with straw, covered by a coarse linen sheet or a woolen blanket. In less prosperous inns, a guest might sleep directly on a pallet of straw laid across the floor. These simple comforts came with their own inconveniences. The straw flattened with use, shifting beneath the body, carrying with it the earthy scent of the field from which it had been cut. It was enough, however, to soften the weight of the day's exhaustion. The sound of the night were distinctive. Where the common room had carried voices, now it carried breathing, slow, uneven, overlapping. A cough here, a snore there, the creak of wood as someone shifted in their sleep. Occasionally, the restless murmur of a dream broke the stillness, only to fade again into the general rhythm of slumber. Outside, the wind might tap against the shutters or a dog bark in the distance, muffled by the thickness of timber walls. These sounds, though hardly silent, created a kind of lull, a reminder that one was surrounded by others, all sharing the same necessity of rest. Sleep in such conditions was rarely uninterrupted. The closeness of bodies, the heat of a crowded room, and the occasional presence of lice or fleas could disturb the night. Travelers might wake briefly, roll over, adjust their cloaks, or mutter quietly before slipping back into drowsiness. Yet even with these disturbances, the inn offered something that the open road could not: safety, to sleep beneath a roof, within walls, and among fellow travelers was a comfort greater than the inconvenience of shared space. The innkeeper and their household did not rest easily. Their duties stretched into the night, ensuring the fire did not die completely, keeping an ear tuned for quarrels, securing valuables, and sometimes tending to guests who fell ill. Their livelihood depended not only on providing food and shelter, but also on maintaining order. A night could pass uneventfully, or it could be broken by disputes, drunkenness, or urgent arrivals at the door. For the innkeeper, vigilance was as much a part of life as hospitality. In larger towns, and sometimes doubled as way stations for official messengers. A rider might arrive at any hour, pounding at the door with a sealed letter to be passed along. Such interruptions brought a brief stir to the house, the clatter of hooves outside, the hurried exchange of words, before silence settled again. To most travelers, these moments were little more than disturbances in their uneasy sleep, but to the world beyond, they carried the lifeblood of communication across medieval Europe. As dawn approached, the atmosphere of the inn shifted once more. Before the sun had risen, the earliest risers stirred. Pilgrims rose to resume their journey before the roads grew busy. Merchants checked their goods, adjusting packs and balancing satchels. Animals in the stable outside announced the morning with wickers, bleats, and the shuffle of hooves. Inside, the inn stirred awake with the faint sounds of movement, the scratch of flint as the fire was coaxed back to life, the slow swell of voices returning. The night, though imperfect, had served its purpose. Rest, however uneven, had been gained. The weary limbs of travelers found renewal, however slight, and the road could be faced again. For the medieval inn, this was the rhythm of existence, the constant cycle of arrivals and departures, of meals shared and beds filled, of evenings alive with voices and nights humming with breath. And for the traveler, the night was a reminder that life on the road was a collective experience. To lie in the dark, among strangers, was to participate in a shared reality that transcended individual journeys. The inn was not only a building of timber and thatch. It was a resting place of human connection, where the vulnerability of sleep was balanced by the comfort of company. So as you imagine yourself lying upon that straw mattress, listening to the overlapping sounds of breath and the distant whisper of wind outside, you might sense the curious peace that came from this communal rest. It was imperfect, but it was enough. And in that enough, countless travelers, century after century, found the strength to rise again with the morning. Now that we have walked through the experience of arriving at an inn, let us pause and look more closely at the life of the one who made such places possible, the innkeeper. Their presence, though often overlooked in chronicles and records, was essential to the entire system of medieval travel. Behind every bowl of stew, every straw mattress, and every fire kept alive through the night, there was an individual, or often a family, whose work maintained the inn's fragile balance of hospitality and order. Imagine, for a moment, one such innkeeper. We might call him Thomas, though in truth he could have borne any number of names common to the time. His inn sits at a crossroads near Market Town, a place frequented by merchants on their way to sell cloth, grain, or livestock, and by pilgrims passing toward a well-known shrine. For Thomas, the inn is both livelihood and identity. It is not merely where he lives, but what defines his place within the community. His day begins before dawn. While travelers sleep uneasily in the shared chamber, Thomas rises to stir the hearth back into life. The embers from the previous night are coaxed with careful breaths, small twigs added until the flame grows steady. The warmth is not only comfort, but also preparation, for soon water will be heated, bread will be sliced, and the day's first meal must be prepared. His wife or eldest daughter might already be grinding grain, ready to bake coarse loaves for the morning. A son may be in the stable, feeding the animals and checking harnesses for damage. For the innkeeper, labor is constant and varied. He is a host, but also a trader, a cook, a stable master, and sometimes a peacekeeper. He must ensure that ale supplies are steady, often brewed on site in small batches, or purchased in bulk when trade allows. He must negotiate with local farmers for meat, vegetables, and dairy. He must also track the flow of coins, for while hospitality has its customs, the inn is above all a business. Too much generosity, and he risks ruin. Too much greed, and his reputation withers, leaving him without guests. Records from the Middle Ages sometimes mention disputes involving innkeepers. Complaints about watered-down ale, overcharging, or poor bedding were not unusual. Regulations in certain towns required inns to maintain a fair price, and officials occasionally inspected them to ensure standards were kept. To be an innkeeper, then, was to live under constant scrutiny, not only from guests who might spread word of their experience, but also from local authorities who saw inns as both useful and potentially troublesome places. Yet the role also carried opportunities. Inns were hubs of information. Thomas, our imagined innkeeper, might hear news of distant wars before many in his village. Merchants spoke of prices in faraway markets, pilgrims of visions and relics, and messengers of royal decrees. In his common room, stories of the world converged. Though Thomas himself might never travel more than a few miles from his inn, he possessed a knowledge that spanned kingdoms. In this way, innkeepers occupied a curious space, stationary yet worldly, rooted yet informed. Family life intertwined with the business. Children of innkeepers often grew up accustomed to strangers passing through, to long hours of labor, to the unpredictability of guests. A daughter might carry trays of food, learning to judge when a traveler could be trusted and when caution was wise. A son might learn early the skills of brewing, measuring hops and barley with a practiced hand. The household itself became part of the fabric of the inn, their lives shaped by the rhythm of arrivals and departures. Challenges were many, and sometimes attracted trouble. Quarrels between drunkards, theft, or the arrival of armed men demanding more than they would pay for. Disease, too, was a constant shadow. With travelers came sickness, coughs, fevers, and sometimes outbreaks that could sweep through towns. To run an inn was to live with a heightened awareness of these risks, and yet to accept them as part of the calling. Despite these burdens, the life of an innkeeper could be stable compared to that of a wandering laborer or a tenant farmer, then offered steady income, and with it, a degree of status. Many innkeepers became respected figures in their communities. Some even rose to civic roles, serving as aldermen or council members in towns. In wills and records, we occasionally see their names, leaving behind property, tools, and coin to their heirs. Though rarely remembered as individuals in the grand sweep of history, they were anchors in their time, quietly sustaining the movement of people and goods across the land. To imagine Thomas at the close of a day is to picture a man weary but watchful. The guests are asleep upstairs, the fire is dimmed, and he sits at a table counting the day's coins by candlelight. His hands are roughened from years of labor, his clothes carrying the scents of smoke and ale. He is neither noble nor poor, but something in between, one of countless figures who maintain the invisible structures of medieval life. Without such people, travel would have been harsher, journeys longer, and the threads of connection between places weaker. In remembering him, we remember countless others. The innkeeper stands as a symbol of those who worked not in glory, but in necessity. Through their labor, the roads of medieval Europe remained passable not only in body, but in spirit. Travelers could endure because, at the end of a weary day, someone waited with a hearth, a meal, and a place to rest. Among the many travelers who passed through the inns of medieval Europe, few were as numerous or as influential as pilgrims. Their journeys, undertaken in devotion and hope, shaped not only the roads, but the very livelihood of inns along the way. To walk the pilgrimage routes was to follow a thread woven across the continent, connecting distant shrines and local villages, and inns became the beads strung upon that thread. Consider the road to Canterbury, one of the most famous destinations of the later Middle Ages. After the martyrdom of Thomas Becket in 1170, pilgrims flocked to his shrine, seeking miracles, forgiveness, or spiritual renewal. The journey was long for many, and rarely could it be completed without pause. Inns grew up along the path, offering food and lodging to those making their way toward the cathedral city. These were not grand establishments, but modest houses adapted to a steady flow of travelers. Yet for the pilgrims, they were as important as the shrine itself, for without rest the journey could not be sustained. One can imagine a group of pilgrims setting out at dawn, their staffs tapping against the road, their cloaks drawn close against the chill. They might be merchants, peasants, knights, or nuns. Pilgrimage was one of the few activities in which people of many classes mingled. By evening, they would seek an inn where the shared table erased, for a time, some of the distances between them. A knight might sit beside a miller, a merchant beside a poor widow, each sharing the same bread, each listening to the same stories. The common room of such an inn was more than a place of eating. It became a stage for storytelling. Tales were exchanged not only to pass the time, but to bind travelers together. This practice was later immortalized by Geoffrey Chaucer in his Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century. Though Chaucer's work is a literary invention, it reflects a truth. Inns on the pilgrimage road were crucibles of voices, where the diversity of medieval society was briefly gathered under one roof. The economic importance of pilgrimages cannot be overstated. Inns thrived on the steady traffic, and towns along popular routes grew wealthier from the constant flow of visitors. Local farmers sold grain and meat to the innkeepers. Brewers kept barrels ready. Craftsmen repaired shoes, saddles, and staffs. Pilgrimages created entire economies of movement, and the inn was their beating heart. Without inns, the roads would have been harsher, the journeys slower, and the pilgrims fewer. Yet the influx of travelers also carried risks. Inns could become crowded, their air heavy with smoke, sweat, and the murmur of many voices. Outbreaks of illness were not uncommon. Officials sometimes worried that inns might spread disorder or vice, and regulations attempted to control them. In some places, inns were required to keep lists of guests or to limit the amount of ale served. Still, enforcement was uneven, and the atmosphere could shift quickly from pious fellowship to boisterous revelry. Despite these challenges, the role of the inn during pilgrimages remained deeply valued. For pilgrims, the inn was more than a resting place. It was a space of transition, marking the passage between stages of the journey. The comfort of a meal, the warmth of a fire, the murmur of prayers spoken together before sleep, all became part of the rhythm of devotion. Some pilgrims even recorded the names of notable inns in their journals, ensuring that future travelers would know where kindness and fair dealing could be found. Inns also played a role in the spiritual imagination of the time. The act of welcoming strangers echoed biblical teachings about hospitality, reminding both innkeepers and pilgrims of their shared faith. To serve a pilgrim was, in some eyes, to serve Christ himself. This belief lent dignity to the work of the inn, elevating the mundane acts of brewing ale or preparing stew into gestures of sacred service. Imagine, for a moment, a weary pilgrim arriving at such an inn after days of walking. His feet are blistered, his shoulders aching beneath the weight of his bundle. Yet as he steps inside, the smell of stew greets him, mingling with the crackle of a fire. Other pilgrims nod in welcome, and a place is made at the table. He sets down his staff, loosens his cloak, and breathes deeply. For that night, the road is forgotten, and he is simply a man among companions. The inn holds him in its circle of warmth, a fragile sanctuary between the hardships of travel and the holiness of the shrine ahead. Thus, inns on the pilgrimage routes were more than businesses. They were part of the spiritual landscape, shaping how the faithful experienced their journey. Each bowl of food, each shared bed, each whispered prayer in the dimness of a crowded room became part of the larger story of devotion. Though the cathedrals and shrines remained the celebrated monuments of the age, the humble inn was their necessary partner, carrying countless pilgrims through the long miles that led to grace. The road to Canterbury was only one thread in the wide tapestry of medieval pilgrimage. Across Europe, countless paths led to shrines, cathedrals, and relics that drew the faithful onward. Whether a traveler sought the bones of saints in Santiago de Compostela, the relics of apostles in Rome, or a smaller local shrine in their own region, the need for food, shelter, and companionship remained constant. And wherever pilgrims went, inns stood ready to receive them. The route to Santiago, stretching across France and into the north of Spain, was among the most famous. Pilgrims from every corner of Christendom joined the flow, their steps guided by the scalloped shell, the emblem of St. James. The roads were long, and the terrain varied: forested paths, open plains, and steep mountains. Along this immense journey, inns marked each stage, their doors opening to travelers speaking many languages, each carrying hopes and burdens of their own. For some, the pilgrimage was penance. For others, thanksgiving. For many, it was simply a chance to step away from the routines of daily life. In Rome, the eternal city, pilgrims arrived to venerate the tombs of St. Peter and St. Paul. The inns of the city swelled with visitors, their common rooms filled with accents from across Europe. To walk the streets of Rome during a holy year was to encounter a living map of Christendom, embodied in the diversity of its pilgrims. Inns became crossroads of culture, places where a traveler from the distant north might sit beside one from the Mediterranean coast, both resting their weary bodies in the same straw-filled chamber. Closer to home, countless smaller shrines also attracted pilgrims. A holy well, a relic of the Virgin, or the tomb of a local saint could draw steady streams of visitors. For the small villages near these sites, the arrival of pilgrims was both a blessing and a burden. Inns multiplied to meet demand, their business waxing and waning with the feast days of the saints. In some towns, entire streets were lined with hostels and taverns, each vying for the patronage of passing pilgrims. The experience of the inn on these journeys carried a rhythm familiar across regions. A pilgrim might walk until sunset, scanning the horizon for the sign of a house with lantern light or painted emblem. On arrival, he or she would be greeted not only by food and bed, but often by conversation. Stories of miracles were exchanged, directions given, and warnings shared about dangerous stretches of road. In this way, inns served as repositories of information, their common rooms echoing with the practical lore of the road. Innkeepers themselves became key figures in this culture. Some were remembered for their kindness, others for their sharp dealings. A generous innkeeper might be praised in pilgrims' tales, while a dishonest one could be condemned in satire or song. The reputation of an inn could spread far beyond its walls, carried by travelers who spoke of their experiences to others along the road. For those who ran these establishments, each arriving pilgrim was both a guest to be cared for and a potential witness to their conduct. The mixture of sacred devotion and ordinary need gave the inns of pilgrimage routes a curious duality. Within their walls, one could hear both prayers and laughter, songs of faith and complaints about sore feet, quiet devotion and the rattle of dice on a table. The sacred and the mundane intertwined, just as they did in the lives of the pilgrims themselves. We might picture one evening in a Spanish inn, not far from Santiago. The fire burns low, and the benches creak beneath the weight of weary travelers. A pilgrim from Germany hums a hymn under his breath. A woman from the French countryside rubs ointment into blistered feet. A young man from Italy, eager to speak, tells of the relics he has seen in Rome. The innkeeper, moving quietly among them, ensures bowls are filled and straw mats prepared. Though they come from distant lands, for this night they are companions. Tomorrow, they will rise at dawn, shoulder their packs, and move on toward the shrine. But for these few hours, the inn is a world unto itself, an island of rest in a sea of journeying. The legacy of these pilgrim inns endures not in monuments of stone, but in the memory of countless footsteps and countless nights. The great cathedrals remain standing, their towers reaching skyward, but the small inns that once lined the roads have mostly vanished. What survives is the idea that hospitality along the road was essential to the rhythm of devotion, that the journey itself was shaped as much by bread and firelight as by relics and prayers. In this way, inns were silent partners in the great spiritual movements of the Middle Ages. Without them, the act of pilgrimage would have been harsher, lonelier, and perhaps less widespread. With them, it became not only possible but deeply human, binding together strangers in the shared experience of travel. When we walk the streets of medieval towns today, it is rare to find a surviving inn that looks much as it did in the Middle Ages. Unlike the great castles or cathedrals, inns were not built to endure centuries. Many were timber-framed, their beams exposed to weather, their walls plastered and painted, their roofs thatched or tiled with clay. Fire, neglect, and the slow work of time erased them from a landscape. What we know of them is often pieced together from fragments, an excavated foundation here, a discarded pot there, a reference in a city record or a traveler's diary. Archaeology provides us with glimpses into this vanished world. In towns across England, layers of earth have yielded shards of pottery, iron keys, and worn coins, each suggesting the bustle of daily life. A fragment of a cooking pot might recall the countless stews served to weary travelers. A rusted horseshoe, discarded near an entrance, whispers of the steady traffic of hooves. Even the broken remnants of ale jugs speak of fellowship and conversation, now silent. Sometimes entire structures have left faint outlines. Excavations in York, London, and other medieval centers have uncovered the post holes of timber halls believed to have been inns or taverns. From these patterns, archaeologists reconstruct how the spaces were arranged. A large common room for eating, smaller chambers for sleeping, a stable adjoining the yard. Though nothing of the timber itself survives, the impressions in the ground allow scholars to sketch the frame of buildings that once welcomed travelers by the hundreds. Written records provide another layer of evidence. Town officials often regulated inns, recording licenses and disputes. These texts might mention the number of beds an inn was allowed to keep, the price of ale, or fines imposed for disorderly behavior. They remind us that inns were both essential and sometimes troublesome. From them we learn not only about architecture, but about reputation, who was known as a reliable host, and who drew complaints for dishonesty or rowdiness. There are mysteries, too, that remain unresolved. Some inns appear in records by name, the White Hart, the Swan, the Tabard, but their exact locations are lost. Streets have shifted, houses rebuilt, landmarks renamed. Scholars walk the modern roads with maps in hand, seeking traces of where an inn once stood. A cellar doorway, a reused beam, or a carving half-hidden in stone may hint at the answer. The inn itself is gone, but its shadow lingers. Cultural memory preserves another set of clues. In literature, inns became stages where characters met, quarreled, and told stories. Plays and poems preserve their atmosphere, even when the buildings themselves did not. These descriptions, though colored by imagination, give us a sense of what an inn felt like. The press of bodies in a smoky hall, the uneven benches at the trestle tables, the flicker of rushlights on plaster walls. They show us that inns were not merely practical shelters, but symbols of community, chance encounters, and a mingling of lives. Artifacts, documents, and stories come together like tesserae in a mosaic. No single piece is enough, but together they form an image, however incomplete. We might never know the precise sound of voices in a particular inn or the exact aroma of a stew simmering in its hearth, but we can approximate them through comparison. A scrap of parchment mentioning a barrel of ale, combined with a surviving jug unearthed in a dig, and with a passage from Chaucer describing a bustling tavern, all joined to create a picture vivid enough to imagine. One of the most intriguing aspects of archaeological work on inns is the study of refuse. Pits near former sites yield bones of animals consumed, shells of oysters, seeds of herbs once used in cooking. From them, we know that travelers ate not only bread and broth, but also delicacies when available, depending on region and season. These remains remind us that the experience of the inn was shaped by the land around it, its rivers, its fields, its trade connections. The mystery lies in the silences. For every shard recovered, countless others are lost. For every inn recorded, many more were never noted. The inns of small villages, serving local travelers and forgotten pilgrims, are gone without trace. What endures is an impression. That medieval life was stitched together not only by monumental stone, but also by fragile timber, clay, and memory. And so, archaeology invites us into a kind of listening. We lean down to the soil, sift through debris, and hear the faint echoes of laughter, the shuffle of boots, the quiet prayer of a pilgrim before sleep. Though the buildings crumble, the rhythm of their use lingers, waiting for us to notice. The mystery of medieval inns lies not in dramatic ruins, but in these subtle remnants that suggest, rather than declare, the world they once held. If archaeology gives us fragments of timber and pottery, literature and art give us something equally important: the way medieval people imagine their inns. To step into a medieval text is to find inns scattered throughout, appearing as stages where lives intersected. They were settings for stories of chance meetings, of quarrels, of beginnings and endings. Their presence in cultural memory is so strong that they sometimes seem more vivid in tales than in the soil where they once stood. One of the most famous examples, of course, is Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Though written in the late 14th century, it captures an inn not as an archaeological ruin, but as a bustling stage. At the Tabard Inn in Southwark, pilgrims gather before setting off on their journey. They meet not as characters chosen for solemn devotion, but as a lively mix of trades, temperaments, and voices. The inn becomes the frame that holds their tales, the place where the idea of sharing stories becomes natural. For Chaucer's readers, and for us, the inn is remembered less for its physical beams and more for its atmosphere of mingling lives. But Chaucer was not alone. In plays, morality tales, and songs, inns were places of choice and consequence. A traveler might meet honest fellowship or temptation. An inn might be remembered as a site of kindness, where bread was shared, or as a den of deception, where dice rattled late into the night. In this way, the inn served as a mirror of society itself, a place where the sacred and the profane coexisted, where human weakness and generosity stood side by side. Medieval art also recorded inns, though often in small details. Illuminated manuscripts occasionally depict travelers at rest, sitting at tables or leading horses into stables. The images are not grand. They are small vignettes tucked between scenes of battle or worship, but they tell us that inns were recognized as essential parts of the world. To draw a journey without an inn would have been incomplete, for every road needed its pause. Every traveler is fire and bread. Legends and folk tales often wove inns into their fabric. A wandering saint might find shelter at a humble inn, the host rewarded for generosity with unexpected blessing. A deceitful innkeeper might be punished in the tale, serving as a warning against greed. These stories, repeated across regions, gave moral shape to the ordinary act of hospitality. They reminded listeners that even a bowl of stew could carry spiritual weight. The duality of the inn, half practical, half symbolic, made it a fertile ground for imagination. It was both an ordinary business and a place of threshold. To enter an inn was to step out of the dangers of the road and into a space of temporary belonging. Yet because the stay was never permanent, it also symbolized the transience of life. A pilgrim rested, ate, prayed, and moved on. The inn was not a home, but it provided the illusion of one, a reminder that life itself was a journey between stopping points. Writers used this symbolism freely. Preachers compare the inn to the church, offering rest and nourishment to weary souls. Poets liken the inn to the body itself, sheltering the spirit for a time before the greater journey continued. Even legal texts occasionally spoke of the inn as a metaphor for temporary possession, something one held only in passing. The ordinary building of timber and clay thus carried meanings far beyond its walls. For modern historians, these layers of cultural memory are both gift and challenge. They give us rich descriptions, but they are colored by metaphor and exaggeration. Was a particular and truly as lively or as unruly as a poet suggests? Did every common room echo with laughter and dice? Likely not. Yet the persistence of these depictions shows how inns captured the medieval imagination. They were more than background. They were symbols of encounter, chance, and the fragile bonds of community. Imagine, for a moment, a medieval listener hearing a tale of a saint who was turned away from a greedy innkeeper. The story might be told in a churchyard or by a fire. Though the details might be fictional, the audience would have known the setting well. The smoky room, the creaking benches, the host's careful hand counting coins. The familiarity gave the story its weight. It was not about a far-off castle or an unreachable court, but about a place that every traveler knew. This blending of the ordinary and the moral is part of what makes medieval inns so elusive. In the soil, they dissolve into pottery shards and post holes. In the texts, they expand into moral landscapes, standing for temptation, kindness, or the brevity of life. Between these extremes lies the truth, that the medieval inn was both a physical shelter and a symbol. It was a place of rest, of commerce, of mingling, and at the same time, a metaphor for the journey of the soul. If we cannot walk into a medieval inn today, we can still hear faint echoes of its presence in the fragments left behind, not only objects and texts, but in proverbs, songs, and customs that drifted down through the centuries. These echoes give us a sense of the atmosphere that once filled those smoky rooms and timbered halls. Consider the tavern songs preserved in manuscripts. Though the melodies are often lost, the words remain, hinting at the blend of cheer and weariness that accompanied the road. Verses speak of ale, of fleeting friendship, of the comfort of fire on a stormy night. Some are playful, teasing the innkeeper or mocking the dice players who lost their coin. Others are more solemn, comparing the inn to a resting place on life's greater journey. These songs, scribbled in margins or remembered in later collections, show that the inn was not only a business but a space of shared voice. Proverbs, too, carry the memory of inns. Medieval sayings often warned against excessive drinking or praised the kindness of a host. To say that someone kept an inn without a fire was to suggest meanness or neglect. To note that all roads meet at the tavern was to acknowledge the inn's role as a crossroads of human life. These phrases, simple yet enduring, root the inn in the language itself, preserving what the walls no longer show. In some towns, the names of streets still whisper of long-lost inns. Tavern Street, the Bell Yard, the Swan Lane, these traces remind us that once a particular building stood there, welcoming travelers. The inn itself may be gone, its timbers burned or replaced, but the name persists like a ghost in the map, a reminder of the world beneath the modern pavement. Archaeology occasionally uncovers more than objects. It uncovers patterns of sound. In cellars where fragments of drinking vessels lie, scholars imagine the clatter of mugs against wood. In courtyards where horseshoes were discarded, they hear the echo of hooves. These reconstructions are quiet, detached, yet they restore the rhythm of life to otherwise silent remains. They remind us that the inn was never a still monument, but a place of constant motion, filled with arrivals, departures, laughter, complaints, and weary silence. Literary depictions also add to this echoing chorus. Chroniclers described royal processions pausing at great inns, where banners fluttered and trumpets sounded. Ballads told of highwaymen lurking near taverns, reminding travelers that the inn was both refuge and risk. Satirical poems mocked innkeepers who watered down ale, a complaint so common that it seems almost timeless. Each account is colored by perspective, yet together they give us a mosaic of voices that keep the memory of inns alive. Imagine, if you will, a quiet evening in the 14th century. A traveler sits at a wooden table, his cloak damp from the rain. Beside him, a group of laborers share bread, their laughter rising above the crackle of the fire. In the corner, a scholar recites a verse he has memorized, while a merchant negotiates over the price of wool. The innkeeper moves among them, steady and watchful. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters, but inside, the world is momentarily contained in warmth and company. None of this scene survives in stone or parchment. Yet in songs, in sayings, in the faint outlines of walls uncovered by excavation, we catch glimpses. The mystery of medieval inns lies in this mixture of presence and absence. They were once everywhere, along roads, in towns, at crossroads. And yet today, they are elusive, half-forgotten. We know them not through grand ruins, but through fragments, whispers, and echoes. To study them is to accept incompleteness, to be content with shadows and impressions. And perhaps that is fitting, for the inn itself was always a temporary thing. A traveler stayed only a night or two. Friendships formed by the fire dissolved at dawn. Even the buildings, made of wood and clay, were never meant to stand forever. Their essence was transience, moments of rest between miles, pauses in the larger journey. That they vanish so easily into time seems almost appropriate. What endures is the rhythm they set in motion. The clink of cups, the murmur of prayer, the shuffle of feet on rush-strewn floors. These sounds linger, faint yet insistent, reminding us that behind the great events of history lay countless small pauses, countless evenings in forgotten inns. To listen for those echoes is to draw nearer not only to the past, but to the ordinary people who lived it, resting, eating, and dreaming in places that no longer stand. When we step into the world of medieval inns, it is easy to forget that these were modest, practical spaces, and that just beyond them stood an entirely different universe, the halls of the nobility. To the weary traveler, the inn offered straw for bedding, a wooden bench by the fire, and food served in shared bowls. To a noble household, rest meant carved bedsteads, feather mattresses, embroidered hangings, and feasts with silver goblets. To compare the two is to glimpse the wide divide of medieval society, a contrast that shaped daily experience as surely as walls and roofs. Picture an inn at the edge of a small market town. The traveler arrives after sunset, his boots caked with mud. The door swings open, and he finds a room filled with chatter, the smoke of a hearth rising toward a darkened ceiling. He might receive a bowl of broth with coarse bread, perhaps a slice of salted fish if he is fortunate. His bed will be little more than a pallet in a shared chamber, straw covered with cloth. Privacy is scarce, comfort modest. Yet in this simplicity lies a kind of welcome, a relief from the uncertainty of the road. Now imagine, by contrast, the life of a noble family in their hall. At supper, long trestle tables are set with trenchers of meat, roasted birds, sweetmeats, and wine. The fire in the great hearth blazes brightly, illuminating walls hung with tapestries. Music fills the room, performed by minstrels whose songs praise lineage and valor. Guests are seated according to rank, and servants hurry back and forth, ensuring plates are full and goblets never empty. Here, food is not just sustenance, but spectacle. Lodging is not merely rest, but an expression of wealth and power. The innkeeper and the noble host both offer hospitality, but of profoundly different kinds. The innkeeper's duty was practical: feed the guest, provide a bed, stable the horse. The noble host's duty was ceremonial: display generosity, uphold honor, reinforce status through abundance. Yet both roles were essential. One sustained the weary along the road. The other sustained the hierarchy of society itself. There is a curious symmetry between the two spaces. In the inn, strangers might sit side by side, merchants beside pilgrims, laborers beside scholars. The hierarchy blurred, at least for a moment, under the press of shared need. In the noble hall, the hierarchy was emphasized, reinforced with each gesture and seat assignment. Both environments carried social weight, but in opposite directions, one temporarily leveling, the other firmly stratifying. Objects themselves reveal the contrast. Excavations ovens turn up coarse pottery, wooden bowls, iron knives. Excavations of castles yield silver vessels, delicate glassware, and imported spices still clinging to storage jars. One world was built on durability and necessity, the other on refinement and display. The inn was a place where a traveler patched boots or shared ale, while the hall was a stage for power, marriage alliances, and political intrigue. And yet, despite these vast differences, both worlds were tied together by the fact of travel. Nobles themselves traveled often, on pilgrimage to attend royal courts or to visit their estates, though they were more likely to lodge in monasteries, manors, or the houses of allies. They too occasionally passed through inns. Records mention noble retinues overwhelming small establishments, their servants crowding every chamber. For the innkeeper, such a visit must have been both an honor and a burden. The modest rooms stretched beyond capacity. For the ordinary traveler, it meant yielding space to guests of higher rank. This interplay reminds us that while the inn was a humble space, it existed within the same larger web of movement that carried nobles, merchants, and peasants alike. Roads were the veins of medieval society, and inns were its resting chambers. The hall may have glittered with wealth, but it too relied on the same roads that led past muddy thresholds and smoky hearths. What we see, then, is not simply a contrast of luxury and modesty, but two halves of a larger picture. The inn represents the everyday, the shared, the temporary pause. The hall represents permanence, display, and the structured order of rank. Together, they reveal the layered nature of medieval life, where the journey of a single day could shift between straw and velvet, between coarse bread and spiced wine. For the traveler lying on a straw pallet, listening to the murmur of strangers around him, the noble hall might have seemed impossibly distant. For the noble dining beneath a painted roof, the smoky inn might have seemed irrelevant. And yet both were essential, each answering the same need in different ways. The need for shelter, food, and human company along life's long road. Inns were humble places, yet they were crossroads where lives touched briefly, sometimes across divides of wealth and rank. Most inns were frequented by common merchants, peddlers, pilgrims, or artisans, people of modest means who carried their goods or prayers along the dusty roads. Yet from time to time, members of the elite, minor nobility, well-funded clergy, or traveling officials stepped across the same thresholds. When they did, the atmosphere of the inn changed subtly, shaped by both tension and fascination. Imagine a night when a small retinue of knights arrives late, their cloaks damp with rain. The inn, accustomed to merchants in rough wool, suddenly hosts men wearing spurs, carrying swords, their servants bustling about with baggage. The common guests shift uneasily, giving up benches near the hearth. Conversation softens into murmurs. The innkeeper hurries to provide better fare, perhaps opening a hidden store of wine or spices usually reserved for feast days. To the ordinary traveler, the sudden presence of armed men could be unsettling, a reminder of hierarchy, even in a place that usually blurred such distinctions. For the knights themselves, the inn might have felt cramped, smoky, and ill-suited to their station. Yet necessity dictated acceptance. On the road, the lines of class could bend, though rarely break. The noble retinue might dine separately, their meal served apart from others. Still, they slept under the same roof as merchants and pilgrims, separated only by thin wooden partitions or shared chambers. The juxtaposition was stark. Fine boots set beside muddy clogs, polished swords near rough walking sticks. Records from court rolls occasionally mention disputes born from these collisions. A knight's servant might quarrel with a merchant over a seat at the fire, or a clerk might complain of theft among crowded sleeping rooms. At times, nobles exploited their status, demanding reduced rates or free lodging, leaving innkeepers burdened. Yet other accounts suggest moments of unexpected camaraderie, shared dangers of the road. Robbers, storms, or illness could briefly level distinctions. A noble might listen to a pilgrim's tale, or a merchant might exchange news with a knight bound for campaign. The clergy, too, sometimes entered this mingling space. Though many monasteries offered hospitality, priests and officials traveling through small towns often relied on inns. Their presence added a different kind of authority. A priest blessing the table, or a monk quietly recording expenses in a ledger, lent the inn a tone of solemnity. To others, it was a reminder that even spiritual leaders endured the same discomforts of travel, sleeping on straw and eating coarse bread. What is striking is not just the collision of classes, but the fleeting nature of these encounters. And it was not designed for permanence. Guests came and went, leaving behind scraps of food, stories half told, or debts unpaid. Yet in that fleetingness lay significance. It was one of the rare spaces in medieval society where the noble and the commoner might, however briefly, share the same air, the same fire, the same walls. Artifacts hint at these encounters. Archaeologists have found coins of varied value in sites, small copper pennies alongside silver groats, suggesting both modest and wealthier clientele. A single decorated jug among coarse pottery might signal a night when richer guests were present. Written accounts describe rooms crowded with a mix of voices, French-speaking knights beside English farmers, Latin-quoting clerks beside Flemish merchants. Language itself was a marker of status, yet within the smoky hall, tongues blended into a single background hum. From the perspective of the innkeeper, this mingling was both opportunity and risk. Wealthier guests could bring prestige, but also demands beyond what the inn could reasonably provide. Too many commoners might offend noble sensibilities, yet without them, the inn could not survive. The innkeeper walked a careful balance, adjusting each night according to who came through the door. For the ordinary traveler, the presence of the elite was both awe-inspiring and inconvenient. To share a roof with nobility was a rare glimpse into another world, but it often meant higher costs or less comfort. Some travelers may have resented being displaced from the fire or pressed into corners. Yet for others, it was a story to carry forward, a tale of a night they dined, however distantly, beside men of rank. The road, in this sense, was a great equalizer. Once outside the walls of castles and towns, all faced the same mud, the same storms, the same uncertainty of what awaited at the next stop. The inn reflected this truth. Within its smoky walls, differences remained visible, but they were also softened by circumstance. A noble and a peasant alike needed food, warmth, and sleep. Both listened to the crackle of the same fire before drifting into uneasy dreams. In the calm light of reflection, we see how inns offered a mirror of medieval society, its hierarchies, its tensions, and its fleeting moments of connection. Where the noble hall reinforced divisions, the inn revealed their porous edges. And though these collisions were often brief, they remind us that the road bound all travelers together, from the humblest pilgrim to the most armored knight. As we reach the final stretch of our exploration, it is helpful to linger on what inns represented in the broader structure of medieval life. At their simplest, they were practical places, rooms with straw, food for the hungry, ale for the thirsty, and shelter for the weary. Yet they were also deeply symbolic, reflecting how society functioned, how classes interacted, and how hospitality was understood in different layers of culture. The noble hall embodied permanence and lineage. Its feasts proclaimed wealth, its stone walls testified to power, and its hospitality reinforced bonds of alliance. To dine at a noble's table was to step into a world of ceremony, one where every seat had meaning and every gesture carried weight. By contrast, the inn embodied impermanence. Its doors opened to strangers, its benches shifted nightly, its hearth welcomed whoever happened to pass by. It was a place of flow, a stage where countless small stories began and ended without permanence, much like the journeys of those who stayed within. In this sense, the inn mirrored the road itself. Just as the road carried both noble processions and solitary wanderers, so too did the inn house both the wealthy and the poor, however unevenly. The inn was not an equalizer in the modern sense, for hierarchy persisted, but it was a place where the walls of distinction thinned, where the necessities of travel, food, shelter, warmth took precedence over status. Think of the shared chamber at night. Straw pallets lined up side by side, with little separation beyond a blanket or cloak. A pilgrim, a merchant, a minor noble's servant, perhaps even a knight himself, all breathing in the same smoky air, all lulled by the same fire's glow. Their dreams were surely different, shaped by hopes of trade, salvation, honor, or simple rest. Yet in that moment of sleep, they were united by the vulnerability of being human on the road. At the same time, the contrast with noble hospitality remained ever present. Where a noble host was bound by custom to display generosity and grandeur, the innkeeper was bound by practicality and survival. Hospitality in the hall was about honor. Hospitality in the inn was about endurance. Yet both played vital roles in sustaining the rhythms of medieval life. Without noble feasts, social hierarchies might falter. Without inns, the flow of travel and trade could scarcely continue. The symbolic weight of inns also extended into the imagination of the time. Pilgrims wrote of humble lodgings where they shared meals with strangers, experiences that later colored devotional accounts. Chroniclers noted the presence of officials in wayside taverns, sometimes using the detail to underline the humility of travel. Even poets and storytellers used the image of the inn to signal impermanence, chance meetings, or the uncertainty of the road. In literature, an inn was rarely the final destination, but rather a passing moment, a pause in a larger journey. Excavations confirm this ephemeral nature. Unlike castles with enduring stone or monasteries with monumental churches, inns often left only traces: fragments of pottery, worn coins, broken pins, ash from long cold hearths. These remnants whisper of countless lives that intersected and moved on, leaving barely a mark. Yet their very modesty makes them valuable, a reminder of the ordinary that underpinned the extraordinary. One might even say that inns served as quiet counterpoints to noble grandeur. For every feast in a lord's hall, there were countless suppers of broth and bread in smoky taverns. For every marriage celebrated with pageantry, there were countless small encounters between strangers sharing ale. The balance of society required both. The noble hall declared what society aspired to be. The inn revealed what it was day to day. In reflecting on these contrasts, we see that inns were more than practical spaces. They were microcosms of medieval life. Unsteady, communal, sometimes uncomfortable, yet essential. They remind us that history is not only written in battles and decrees, but also in the soft tread of boots across wooden floors, the quiet murmur of travelers speaking in the dark, the lifting of a simple bowl of broth to tired lips. And so, as we close this segment, imagine once more the contrast. In the great hall, light from torches dances across gilded goblets, music swells, and nobles dine in stately order. In the modest inn, smoke curls toward a low roof, simple pottery clinks against wooden tables, and strangers share stories before drifting into uneasy but necessary sleep. Both scenes belong to the same world. Both tell us something vital about the medieval past. Together, they paint a picture of contrasts and connections, of separation and shared humanity, a world at once distant and familiar. And so, dear listener, our slow passage through the forgotten world of medieval inns and travelers draws to a gentle close. For the past 2 hours, we have wandered together through smoky chambers and crowded sleeping rooms, along muddy roads and into the company of pilgrims, merchants, knights, and innkeepers. We have paused at crossroads where commoners and nobles brushed shoulders, where the humble and the powerful briefly shared the same air, and where the story of ordinary travel unfolded quietly beside the grander narratives of castles and kings. As you rest now, think of the rhythm of their lives. Each inn was a place of pause, a fragile shelter against weather and distance, a fleeting refuge for bodies weary from the road. Within their walls, countless small histories unfolded. Laughter over a shared jug of ale, disputes settled or begun, stories told in low voices before sleep. Most of these moments left no trace, no grand inscription, no lasting monument. Yet together, they shaped the movement of a society that depended on roads, trade, pilgrimage, and the humble act of hospitality. What strikes us when looking back is how familiar it feels in some ways. To seek rest after a long day's journey, to sit by warmth and share food, to find safety in the company of strangers. These are needs that remain as constant now as they were centuries ago. Though our inns may look different today, though our roads are paved and our rooms more private, the essence of the experience remains. Shelter, sustenance, and human connection. And as you prepare to drift into sleep, you might reflect on the comfort of your own surroundings. Unlike the straw pallets of the past, you rest in a bed of your own, in a space that is familiar and secure. Outside your walls, the night is still, and you need not fear the perils of the road. History can remind us not only of what has changed, but also of what endures, and perhaps of what we can quietly be grateful for. So let this gentle history fade into the background of your thoughts. Allow the images to soften, the smoky hearth, the creak of timber, the hum of voices in a crowded hall. Let them dissolve into the quiet of your own room, replaced by the steady rhythm of your breath, the stillness of the present moment. If this kind of storytelling has helped you find rest, feel free to like this video and subscribe to Sleepy Historian, only if it truly brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time of night or morning it is for you. It is strangely comforting to know how many of us drift into sleep together across different places and times, bound by the same old stories. So now, close your eyes, let the road behind us fade, and let the quiet embrace of rest carry you onward. May your night be peaceful, your dreams gentle, and your sleep deep. Until next time, from the Sleepy Historian, good night.